Half the people alive on Earth today exist only because of a single chemical process discovered in a German laboratory in 1909. Remove one industrial process, and within 2 growing seasons, the global food system collapses. Not destabilizes, not struggles, collapses. 4 billion people would face starvation within a decade. That is not a projection from a fringe think tank. That is a consensus estimate of agricultural scientists who have modeled what happens when synthetic fertilizer disappears. It hasn't disappeared. But right now, the countries that control its ingredients, the 3 elements that make modern food production possible, are the same countries at the center of the most dangerous geopolitical conflicts on Earth. And they know exactly what they have. This is the story of the most important war you've never heard of. It isn't being fought with missiles. It's being fought with grain ships, potash mines, and nitrogen plants. And it is already deciding which countries eat and which ones don't. Most people believe the global food system is a vast, resilient network. Thousands of farms, hundreds of trade routes, a diversified web of production so large that no single disruption could bring it down. That world ended sometime in the 1960s, and nobody told you. What actually exists is this. Modern agriculture is a chemical dependency. Nearly 50% of the nitrogen atoms in the human body today were fixed from the atmosphere by an industrial process, the Haber-Bosch process, and delivered to crops via synthetic fertilizer. Without that chemical input, global crop yields would fall by roughly 40 to 50%. The Earth cannot feed 8 billion people on organic nitrogen alone. This is not debatable among agronomists. The specific mechanism that creates the gap between the world people imagine and the world that exists is this. The 3 key inputs to synthetic fertilizer, nitrogen, phosphate, and potash, are geographically concentrated to a degree that makes oil look diversified. And the countries sitting on those deposits have spent the last 5 years learning to use them as weapons. Here's how they did it. And here's why, if you eat food, this is the most important story in the world right now. The central player in this story is not a government. It is a country that became one. Russia. Russia's motivation is not complicated. It controls approximately 13% of global nitrogen fertilizer exports, 21% of potash exports, and through its close ally Belarus, effectively another 18% of global potash supply. Together, Russia and Belarus control roughly 40% of the world's traded potash. Potash is a mineral that makes crops resilient to drought and disease. It cannot be synthesized. You either mine it or you don't grow food. For decades, Russia accepted its role as a commodity supplier. Valuable, certainly, but playing by the rules of global trade. That calculation changed in February 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukraine is not just a country in a war. Ukraine is the breadbasket of a continent. Before the invasion, it supplied 10% of global wheat, 15% of global corn, and 50% of the world's sunflower oil. Russia itself added another 20% of global wheat exports. Combined, these 2 countries were feeding 1 in 3 people in the Middle East and North Africa, 1 in 2 people in some sub-Saharan African nations. The wheat that made the bread in Lebanese markets, Egyptian bakeries, and Yemeni refugee camps, it came from these 2 countries. Then one of them invaded the other, and both of them used food as a weapon. Here is a number that reframes everything. In 2022, global fertilizer prices increased by an average of 80% in a single year. In some markets, nitrogen fertilizer, urea, tripled in price. Farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, who were already operating on margins that left no room for price shocks, simply stopped buying it. The following season, crop yield across Kenya, Ethiopia, Ghana, and Zambia fell by between 20 and 40%. Not because of drought, not because of poor farming, because fertilizer became too expensive to buy. That price spike, engineered in part by Russian export restrictions and sanctions-driven supply disruption, may have caused more hunger than the war itself. Everyone who followed the news in 2022 knows this part. The war in Ukraine blocked grain exports. The Black Sea became a war zone, and there was a global food price crisis. The UN brokered a grain deal. Ships eventually moved. The crisis, we were told, was managed. That is the surface. Now go deeper. The grain crisis was real, but the fertilizer crisis is worse and slower and quieter and far less reported. Here is the mechanism. When a farmer cannot afford fertilizer this season, they either use less of it, reducing yields, or they mine the soil's existing nutrient reserves. Soil mining is what happens when you grow crops without replenishing what they take out. It is invisible in year 1. In year 2, the yield drops slightly. In year 3, it drops more. By year 5, You have degraded farmland that will take a decade and significant investment to restore. Across sub-Saharan Africa and parts of South Asia, farmers have been soil mining at accelerating rates since 2022. The full consequences of that decision, made not freely but out of economic desperation, will arrive as yield collapses between 2025 and 2030. We are not approaching a food crisis. We are already inside one whose worst effects are still incoming. The fertilizer map is a geopolitical map. Look at where the inputs come from. Nitrogen fertilizer requires natural gas as a feedstock. Russia is the world's largest natural gas exporter and one of its largest urea producers. Potash. Canada and Russia/Belarus together control over 70% of global reserves, but Russian and Belarusian potash has been under Western sanctions since 2022. Phosphate. Morocco controls 70% of the world's known phosphate reserves through its state mining company, OCP. China controls most of the rest and periodically bans phosphate exports to protect its own food supply. 3 nutrients. 3 geopolitical choke points. Every one of them currently subject to export restrictions, sanctions, or strategic manipulation. When China banned phosphate exports in 2021 to manage domestic food prices, global phosphate costs surged 40% in 3 months. When Western sanctions cut off Belarusian potash, which have been flowing through Lithuanian ports, global potash prices doubled overnight. These are not market fluctuations. They are policy weapons. You might be sitting in a country where food feels abundant and affordable. Supermarkets are stocked. Prices have risen, but not catastrophically. Here is what you are not seeing. The food on your shelf is the end product of a supply chain that absorbed those fertilizer price shocks over 18 to 24 months. Through farmer margin compression, through government subsidies, through inventory drawdowns. Those buffers are now largely exhausted. The price increases that hit African and Asian food markets in 2022 and 2023 are beginning to arrive in Western grocery stores in diluted form. And the next fertilizer disruption, which geopolitical analysts consider highly probable within the next 3 years, will arrive with far thinner buffers to absorb it. You are not insulated from this. You are delayed. Here is what you think this story is about. Russia weaponizing grain and fertilizer as tools of war in Ukraine. Here is what it is actually about. The Haber-Bosch process itself, and who controls the energy needed to run it. Fritz Haber invented the nitrogen-fixing process in 1909. Carl Bosch industrialized it. By the 1950s, it was feeding the Green Revolution. By 2024, it was consuming 1 to 2% of the entire world's energy supply. More energy than the aviation sector, just to synthesize the nitrogen that grows the food that feeds half of humanity. That energy, overwhelmingly, is natural gas, which means the global food system is not just dependent on fertilizer. It is dependent on cheap natural gas. And cheap natural gas, in Europe especially, which houses a massive nitrogen fertilizer industry, was, until 2022, largely Russian. When Europe sanctioned Russian gas, European nitrogen fertilizer plants shut down. CF Industries in the UK, Yara in Norway, BASF in Germany. Dozens of facilities reduced or halted production because the energy costs made it economically impossible to operate. Europe went from being a significant fertilizer exporter to being a net importer in the space of 18 months. The invisible hand in this story is not Vladimir Putin. It is a Haber-Bosch equation itself. The iron law that says, no cheap energy, no cheap nitrogen, no affordable food. Russia didn't create that dependency. It simply recognized it and pulled the thread. The story was never about wheat and grain ships. It was always about energy and who controls the feedstock that feeds the world. We started with a number. Half the people alive today exist because of a single chemical process discovered in 1909. Here is what that number now means in 2025. That process runs on natural gas. The natural gas is concentrated in Russia, the Middle East, and North America. The potash is concentrated in Canada, Russia, and Belarus. The phosphate is concentrated in Morocco and China. Every one of those geographies is currently subject to either sanctions, export controls, strategic manipulation, or active conflict. The global food system, the system that feeds 8 billion people, is built on a supply chain that has never been more concentrated, more geopolitically exposed, or more deliberately weaponized than it is right now. The verdict is this. Food is no longer just a commodity. It is a geopolitical instrument. And the countries that have not secured their fertilizer supply chains have already lost the first round of a war they don't yet know they're fighting. The world's poorest nations are absorbing that reality in real time. 45 countries are currently classified by the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization as being in food crisis. That number has doubled since 2019. The green revolution that Haber-Bosch made possible is running in reverse, not because we lack the science, but because we have allowed the inputs to become weapons. There's one question nobody in power has yet answered. If Morocco controls 70% of the world's phosphate, and Morocco is a monarchy with its own strategic ambitions, and phosphate is as non-substitutable as oil, what happens when Rabat decides to do what Riyadh did in 1973? We have not had a phosphate embargo yet. We may not be far from one.